This is a special edition of the CardioCast. I'm the voice of MDedge Podcasts, Nick Andrews. In this episode, we bring you a conversation from our award-winning team of journalists who traveled to Paris to cover the 2019 Annual Congress of the European Society of Cardiology. In this conversation, you'll hear from our reporters Mitchel L. Zoler, Kari Oakes, and Bruce Jancin in a conversation led by our editor of MDedge Cardiology, Catherine Hackett. Remember, you can find all of our coverage from ESC 2019 by visiting our website, mdedge.com/cardiology. You can find a link to our site in the podcast notes, wherever notes are found in your particular podcast app. But before we get to our conversation with Catherine and company, I wanted to mention that our latest edition of the CardioCast, the one that dropped the most recent Friday, introduced a new segment called Card Talk with CardioCast host Dr. Jim Dwyer and his brother, who is also a cardiologist, Dr. Jerry Dwyer. Let us know if you like the new addition to the show, and if you'd like to hear more episodes with the brothers Dwyer, you can email us at podcasts@mdedge.com, or you can leave us feedback via the review section in Apple Podcasts or iTunes, wherever you listen. You can also interact with us on Twitter at MDedge Cardio. You can find a link to our Twitter in the podcast notes. Use the hashtag CardTalk or CardioCast if you have a review about our most recent episode, a review about our conversation on ESC 2019, or anything else you'd like to talk about regarding the CardioCast. Okay, without any further ado, let's get to the conversation from Paris, France, between Catherine Hackett, Bruce Jancin, Mitchel L. Zoler, and Kari Oakes.
Welcome to the post-European Society of Cardiology Congress podcast featuring our reporters Bruce Jancin, Mitchel Zoler, and Kari Oakes. We're in Paris. The meeting just finished up this morning, and we're going to just spend a little time going through what we thought were the most practice-changing, important, quirky, and informative studies, and give a little color as to what you might have missed if you weren't there. So we'll begin with what I think we can agree on as the most practice-changing study reported at the meeting, and that was DAPAHF. And Mitch, could you tell us about that?
Yes, so this was looking at dapagliflozin, which is an SGLT-2 inhibitor. And it has been on the U.S. market probably for about 2 or 3 years now, and it's been primarily thought of as a drug for treating patients with diabetes. It does lower blood glucose somewhat, but the significance of this study was to see if it was effective in patients without diabetes but with existing heart failure. And it was. And with a pretty substantial treatment effect. The primary endpoint was, as usually the case in heart failure studies, a combination of reduction in cardiovascular death, heart failure hospitalization, and in this case they used one additional endpoint in the combination that you don't usually see, acute heart failure visits, but any of those 3 events qualified as a primary endpoint, and putting dapagliflozin on top of conventional guideline-directed therapy for patients with heart failure with reduced ejection fraction. So some kind of ACE inhibitor, ARB, or an ARNI, a beta blocker. Many patients were also on a mineralocorticoid receptor antagonist, and on top of all of that, treatment with the dapagliflozin lowered the primary endpoint by 26% compared to placebo, and it was met with pretty much universal acclaim and delight to see this kind of effect in heart failure patients. Another thing that was really notable about it was it had a very good safety profile. And that was something that heart failure physicians who I spoke to were really excited about, because all those other agents I mentioned a moment ago do have various kinds of adverse effects. This looked like it was acting like placebo in terms of adverse effects. And of course, this drug is already on the US market and European markets for a while, but now with this finding, and I should mention that the study, which had about 4,800 people had more or less equal amounts of patients with diabetes, with type 2 diabetes, and patients without. And the reduction in the primary endpoint as well as the secondary endpoints were essentially identical in both groups of patients. So it really opens the door now for using this drug especially once it gets a labeled indication for use in heart failure, which the company will be applying for. This is now a new significant drug that can be added on to HFrEF patients and improve their survival and their not has as many acute heart failure episodes. The survival was also very notable because sometimes you just see the primary endpoint as significant, but it's driven by the hospitalization part. Here, it lowered cardiovascular death by a statistically significant 18% and all-cause death by a statistically significant 17%, which is not seen that often. And again, it added to the importance of what this drug could accomplish. And I think it's also worth putting in perspective why it was even being tested here. As one cardiologist told me, it would have been outlandish 5 years ago to think of trying to use a drug for patients with diabetes and patients with heart failure. But it was just under 4 years ago, by a few days, that at the European Diabetes Society meeting, there was a report from one of the FDA outcome studies, cardiovascular outcome studies, which the FDA mandated close to a decade ago now, I think, that new diabetes drugs had to undergo a substantial safety test for their effect on cardiovascular disease events. And that study 4 years ago, the EMPA-REG outcome study, had this extremely unexpected finding that it was reducing in patients with diabetes new cases of heart failure and also lowering cardiovascular deaths. And that was originally shown for empagliflozin. The other drugs in the class are the dapagliflozin and canagliflozin. And it's now been shown to have that effect, those drugs to have similar effects in patients with diabetes. This is now the first time it's been shown to occur in those without, but a lot of the people I spoke to also suspect that it's going to be a class effect, and any of these three drugs will likely have this similar effect on patients with heart failure but without diabetes. So again, to sum up, this is seen as a really major step forward in how you can further reduce events in patients with HFrEF.
An outstanding result. And we've been talking about this for a while in anticipation of this, how cardiologists are going to start prescribing this, and especially in a place where we live, where there's not exactly a lot of coordination between specialists. A patient might have several specialists, an endocrinologist and primary care physician. Will the cardiologists take it upon themselves to just start prescribing in patients with diabetes? But now, as you say, patients without diabetes, will they go ahead and start prescribing, just taking the bull by the horns and doing that?
Well, the lead investigator of the study cautioned that he wouldn't suggest to start to use it in patients without diabetes until it goes through regulatory review. And in those kinds of situations, there's also often problems getting reimbursement for prescribing the drug, so that would probably put a damper on it. I'm sure if there are patients there who seem to desperately need an additional drug, that they're, say, going into acute episodes frequently, something like that, I wouldn't be surprised if in individualized cases there is a temptation to start using it, even if the patient doesn't have diabetes. But what was notable was, now of course this was at a cardiology conference, but whenever somebody was speaking of the drug subsequent to the reporting of the results, they were saying this is now a heart failure drug. It no longer really is a diabetes drug. And I think there's some validity to looking at it this way, because as a drug for lowering blood glucose or reducing hemoglobin A1C, it's modestly effective. It's not I've spoken to diabetologists who have been uneasy about seeing the cardiovascular benefits from it in patients with diabetes as meaning that it should be used before metformin, say. They still see metformin as the go-to first drug, and this could be an add-on, although cardiologists had been saying even before these results that it was had such powerful effect on reducing heart failure and CV deaths that it should be considered really a first-line drug for patients with diabetes. Now, of course, when you throw in patients without, it's not as much of an issue because you don't have other kinds of glucose-lowering drugs to be worried about should you give them to that patient or not. So I think it's going to be rapidly embraced, and certainly once it gets the approval for the heart failure indication.
Well, thank you. And we're going to move to Bruce Jancin and see, of the sessions that he covered, what is the most practice-changing study that you found?
Well, that's an easy question to answer, actually, because it would be the German study, ISAR React 5. And I know that it's practice-changing because the designated discussant, Gilles Montelescaut, who's a very prominent Parisian interventional cardiologist, said, this is practice changing, and next year in the new guidelines, it will be guideline changing. And he said it with a French accent, and he is a guy with a lot of juice in the interventional cardiology world. This was a head-to-head randomized trial in more than 4,000 acute coronary syndrome patients with STEMI or non-STEMI. And they were randomized as soon as possible after they presented to either ticagrelor or prasugrel, with the idea being that they would be kept on it for 12 months of dual antiplatelet therapy. And these were all patients who were intended for invasive strategy. And they had not, these two potent antiplatelet drugs had not ever been compared head-to-head. The investigators thought that that was a piece of evidence that needed to be obtained, but they were virtually certain that ticagrelor would be the superior drug, and they were somewhat flabbergasted that it was strikingly not. It was opposite the case. The primary endpoint was the 12-month composite of death, MI, or stroke, and that happened in 9.3% of patients in the ticagrelor group and 6.9% in the prasugrel group, and that was a significant 36% difference, and mostly a difference driven by fewer MIs in the prasugrel group. And importantly, that benefit was not obtained at the cost of an increase in bleeding. The bleeding rate was essentially the same in both study arms. And ticagrelor had been the favored agent, and it sounds like it will not be now. There was it could only be speculated as to why the striking and conclusive difference in outcomes. There's some thought that compliance issues might factor in. Prasugrel is a once-daily drug, ticagrelor is too. Unforeseen interactions with other drugs that the patients were taking. It's not really clear, but it was an impressive finding. And so I'd say that was, of the many studies that I went to at this meeting, that was the biggie.
Kari, your biggest practice changer. Kari Oakes.
Thanks, Catherine. As I've been listening to Mitch and Bruce, in sort of thinking about the talks that I attended many more that were prevention strategies, and a lot of these were interventions that occurred at the community level through some really innovative practice models involving collaboration and interdisciplinary work. So I'm not sure I attended one talk that I think would allow a cardiologist to go tomorrow and change the way she's prescribing. But I do think that the one that maybe raised some real questions in terms of management of individuals with diabetes post-PCI was THEMIS, which was another ticagrelor study. And this was added to aspirin in patients with coronary artery disease and diabetes. The study was presented by Deepak Bhatt, both at an early press conference and for the first plenary session when all the big news happened. But these were patients who had type 2 diabetes, established coronary artery disease, and they added ticagrelor to aspirin on top of low-dose aspirin. These were all patients who had what was considered stable coronary artery disease, as in having had a history of PCI, CABG, or angiography for stenosis of at least 50% in one coronary artery. But they excluded people who had a known prior MI or stroke. And so they began people on ticagrelor at 90 milligrams twice daily. And then as the Pegasus TIMI 4 data came out, they reduced that to 60, which is important because this study was complicated by the fact that they lost almost a third of people, over a quarter in the placebo arm and about a third in the ticagrelor arm, primarily because of dyspnea or bleeding events that were thought to be related to the study drug. So that made it a little difficult to figure out what was going on. The primary composite endpoint that they were looking at for all comers, and I think they had about 10,000 people in each arm, just short of 10,000, over a period of, they followed people out to just over 4 years from randomization. They looked at the primary outcome of cardiovascular death, MI, and stroke, and they saw a result that just hit significance. So 7.5% on the placebo arm and 6.9% with ticagrelor hit that endpoint, and the p-value there was 0.038, 0.04, so it was significant. They had, I think, about 18 different pre-specified subgroup analyses, and these were also really carefully examined, and it turned out that there was one subpopulation that ticagrelor seemed to benefit more, and that was people who had had prior PCI. And in discussion and in a video interview we did, Dr. Bhatt said they're not sure exactly why these people seemed to fare better, and they did do significantly better. But he said sort of getting a PCI stress tests you for handling long-term antiplatelet therapy. And so if you've been able to get through that, you've survived, you're doing well enough to enroll in the trial, you may see some benefit from this therapy. Now, having said that, the discussant in the plenary session, Colin Bagent, who specializes in, he's at Cambridge, specializes in really tearing apart clinical trials, wasn't completely convinced. He didn't think that there was enough heterogeneity in the various subgroups to really single out the PCI people. He kind of said more time. But in discussion during the press conference afterward, hearing comments at the session, I think a lot of people feel that these very high-risk people with diabetes, they have coronary artery disease, you want to do as much for them as you can. It may be a worthwhile therapy. And the last thing I'm going to throw in is that Dr. Bhatt and his collaborators used an interesting composite primary endpoint, a couple of them. One was one that they called like the mega bleeding one, where they also included instances of major amputation because of vascular events. Oh, no, the mega ischemic endpoint, where they included patient-centered outcomes like if you have a foot amputated, this severely affects quality of life. So they're experimenting with some of these outcomes that look more at how patients really fare. They also put together a pre-specified but exploratory outcome that looked at, that weighed how the primary endpoints of all-cause mortality and all that factored in with bleeding, and they merged those statistically into one outcome that gives you kind of like a net, are you plus or minus? So he said we might be seeing more of those.
But Kari, if I recall, when you had all the patients together in the main trial, the difference between those on the dual antiplatelet and not was, as you said, modest. And it became much more substantial when they broke it out into the patients with the history of PCI and not. And so on the one hand, it seems like maybe that discussant had a reasonable level of skepticism, but on the other, it seems hard to argue that you have this much more dramatic difference in the treatment arms when you just focus on the patients with the history of PCI. And in the ones without that, I don't recall there being much of a difference at all between the two treatment arms. So it's not clear that it wouldn't be appropriate to focus it on the PCI patients?
Correct. I mean, and the other thing I didn't really bring forward is that looking at this net difference, the people with PCI who received dual antiplatelet therapy did fare somewhat better than the all-comers when you looked at that subgroup. But the safety profile was also better, significantly better, because there was more bleeding in the all-comers group compared with just those on PCI. And I guess that folds back to Dr. Bott's point that this is a subgroup that we know can tolerate this antiplatelet therapy fairly well.
And that's a wrap on this special ESC 2019 edition of the CardioCast by MDedge. For MDedge Podcasts, I'm Nick Andrews.